few months ago, I jumped online and I noticed that someone on a Reddit forum was asking a pretty interesting question. This guy had been considering starting a podcast, but he was worried that all of the money, which I think at least in his mind would inevitably start rolling in from his new show, could potentially create a financial conflict of interest for him. Basically, he had been receiving financial support from the government due to a disability, and he was worried that all of this additional income from podcasting would put him at risk of losing that financial support. Those on the forum who had been podcasting for a while all basically just kind of collectively had a good laugh over the premise. One podcaster responded, "Should we tell him? Because it's pretty well known at this point, at least within podcasting communities, that most shows will never really reach the kind of popularity that would potentially bring any significant money in. In fact, for many like myself, I have made negative monies. I mean, it's not that it can't happen. I'm quite certain that it does happen all of the time. It's just that, I think that a lot of the people who have found ways to make money doing it probably just kind of caught lightning in a bottle somehow. Or maybe they have a knack for business and marketing, or maybe they've just been around for long enough where they were able to build up a huge audience over the years before the market became so oversaturated like it is now. In the early days of the pandemic, people were just kind of forced to stay home and they had to find new hobbies in the limited space that they had. Podcasting was one of those options, and millions of people chose to start one of their own shows for the first time. I don't want to act like I was podcasting before podcasting was cool. I was not. I started not that long ago in 2019, after a couple of years of being on the fence about it. I mean, it's a big investment. A lot of the shows that are well known today have been around a long time. Podcasting used to be a lot more difficult than it has become in recent years. It's pretty user-friendly nowadays. And I am one of the millions of no-names who came in after it became easy. So really, basically, it's so much easier to start a show now than it used to be. And therefore, there are a lot more people doing it. And again, there's really no standard that an individual actually has to meet in order to become a podcaster and have their voice blasted all over the internet. I am the perfect example. Anyone can do it. It's also possible that hosts that are doing really well already had some sort of built-in audience. Like, maybe they were already established influencers or bloggers or celebrities who had thousands of followers already on social media or whatever, Or maybe they have corporate backing or lots of money to spend on advertising, or they already had 1 million Facebook friends or whatever, I don't know. I'm not saying that those who found success were just lucky. What I am saying is that there are many factors to finding success. And creating a good, entertaining quality product does not necessarily equal success. In an ideal world, I suppose that entertainment creation would exist within a meritocracy where the best quality product finds the most success and rises to the top. But of course, quality is subjective, and this is not an ideal world. In addition to being a content creator myself, I am also a frequent listener of other people's shows. Trying to find a new podcast that I love can be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of really great quality content out there that people just don't know about yet. I know that there is. It's just that it isn't popular enough yet to have found its way to the thousands of people who would certainly love it if they only knew that it existed. And even though those shows are good, they're just kind of sitting out there waiting to be discovered. And oftentimes they never really do. It reminds me of the movie Lost in Paris, which is one of my favorites. One of the most memorable movies I've seen in recent years. And I think that if I asked 10 out of 10 of my friends if they've seen Lost in Paris and how they feel about it, 10 of them would probably say, I have no idea. I've never seen it. How are content creators supposed to find the people who would love their show as much as they themselves love their favorite show? As somebody who is both a podcaster and also somebody who loves to listen to podcasts, it seems to me that both parties trying to discover one another should ultimately be the goal of everybody involved. And yet it's still so difficult. I am constantly looking for new podcasts that I would love, but I find them so rarely. Some of my favorite shows were created by people that I only know about because I gave their show a chance after finding them in some random place on the internet. For example, sometimes I listen to this nerdy science podcast called Knick-Knack News, and I only know about them because we were in the same meetup group a few years back when I lived in Cleveland. I believe that their show is one of the better ones out there, at least that I've found so far. And yet, I only know about them because we once lived in the same city. How many other podcasts in other cities are there that nobody knows about that I haven't found because I didn't know who they were? Knick-Knack News has like less than 100 Facebook followers, which really doesn't seem like very much. And yet, in spite of their lack of popularity, they continue to be one of the few shows that I personally keep in my feed, in my regular rotation, years after I found out about them. That's the odd thing about podcasting, is that I've lived in multiple cities in the last 10 years or so, and I've had new sets of friends everywhere I go. And yet, some of the podcasts that I've listened to throughout that journey, those people stay with me the entire time. It is the one consistent thing in my life. I suppose that using social media follows in order to try to find out how popular a show is probably isn't the perfect method, but I do think that it kind of gives me a general idea. It's hard to tell. I also listen to this news podcast called Tangle, where the host, I think his name is Isaac Saul. He first gives the opinion of the people on the left, and then he gives the opinion of the people on the right, and then he gives his own opinion at the end. And I don't always agree with him, but as a moderate person myself, I really appreciate that. If I'm not mistaken, I only know about this show because I saw somebody talking about it on a podcasting subreddit. I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but it might have been Isaac. I don't know. That daily program has just over 5,000 followers on Twitter and 524 followers on Facebook, which is pretty good, I guess, but not as much if I compare it to that of one of the more popular shows that I enjoy. The Stuff You Should Know podcast has over 800,000 followers on Facebook and 103,000 on Twitter. And sometimes I also listen to the most popular podcaster on earth, who has 9 million Twitter followers and 7 million on Facebook. There is this huge disparity between the amount of listeners that my favorite podcasts have. And yet, I can't say that the ones that are less popular overall are any less meaningful to me than the big ones are, at least personally. And by comparison, I myself, as a podcaster, have 1 Facebook follower and 0 Twitter followers, at least the last time I looked. And that's all it is, and it's all it will ever be. When I feel the need to vent about something, or I just need to be creative, this is where I go to do it nowadays. When I started my first show a few years back, though, I approached it with a completely different mindset. It was a locally themed show talking about the city that I lived in at the time. And once we got some experience and momentum, I thought we were pretty decent, at least in my own humble opinion. I honestly thought at first that the local people in Cleveland would really enjoy it, or maybe the transient people who were moving into town would appreciate it as a valuable resource for learning how to live well in their new city. But ultimately, none of that came to fruition. We had a lot more haters than we did people who actually outspokenly enjoyed it. Most of that hate came from anonymous people online, so whatever, But still, at the end of the day, the number of listeners that we actually had was pretty much abysmal, in spite of all our years of hard work and best efforts. In late 2021, my co-host and I, we reunited to do one final episode, and we kind of explained to anybody who might be listening exactly why we were ending the show. It can really be kind of hard to stay interested in a creative project when very few people actually show any interest in what you're doing. When you're a creative person, when you're an artist, or when you're a musician, it's really easy to allow self-doubt to creep in. Like, maybe the reason why people aren't excited about my art is maybe it's just really not all that great. In my opinion, there are a lot of factors that make people enjoy what they enjoy. And me personally, I wouldn't necessarily put quality at the top of those list of factors. But in regards to the podcast that I created with my friend, eventually the weight of the lack of interest and excitement about the show from listeners, it just basically wore on us. And while honestly COVID was the thing that killed it, once we had the opportunity to return, I don't believe that either of us were really all that interested in putting that much effort into something that gave us back so little in return the first time. And in addition to that, my co-host wasn't aware of this at the time, but I was quietly planning to move out of town by that point. And little did I know that he was actually planning his exit from the city as well. This city that we literally made a podcast about. I moved first, and a few months later, so did he. I moved to sunny Florida, and he moved to DC. Don't get me wrong, we did have a lot of fun, and we got to meet a lot of really cool, amazing people. But it was just never going to be sustainable long term if we didn't see some sort of popularity explosion at some point. You know? My friend Derek, and I don't know if he considers me a friend back, it's irrelevant. Derek, if you're listening, I'm going to call you a friend for the sake of this conversation. If you've listened to my How to Start a Podcast series, which I did earlier in the year, then you would have heard Derek talking about some of his insights on the process. And you would have already heard me say that I just kind of basically copycatted some of his methods on how to start a show myself. Although their podcast really wasn't exactly the same type that ours was. I always kind of just felt this kind of bond towards it, if that makes sense. Like, as if their show was almost kind of like an older brother to our show. But recently, Derek and his co-host announced that they were wrapping things up and that their show was coming to an end as well, which is very much bittersweet. If I'm not mistaken, I think that Derek and his co-host started their show like maybe a year before I started mine with my co-host for the first time. Me and my co-host's show, it lasted 2 years, maybe 3, if you include the finale that we came back to, and I think that theirs probably went 4 years. Theirs ended maybe like a half a year after ours. I recently listened to their final episode, and a lot of their reasons for ending their show seemed kind of like the same reasons why my co-host and I decided to end ours. They just found it ridiculous to put so much effort into something for so long that didn't make any money. Especially when there were other things out there that they could be doing that would be far more lucrative. And one of them mentioned that when they started out, he had big dreams of the show taking off one day and growing some sort of huge audience, which honestly, probably most podcasters never do. Why would anybody put themselves through this? So much effort for such little appreciation. I did it, and obviously I still do. Lots of people do it. What is wrong with us? My previous episode of the Great Big Intergalactic has a grand total of 2 listeners so far, which is rare, but what is the point of doing any of this? Is there anybody listening? Is there anybody out there? So I went online and I basically just asked other people who had made the same decision, why did you make the decision to end your show? The host of a show called Inter-Party Conflict responded and said, I hosted a tabletop gaming advice podcast. We ended after 5 years. It had always been a lot of work. Ultimately, the decision came when my brother was diagnosed with cancer early last year. And there was a time when I found myself stressing over whether my work and my podcasting schedules gave me enough time to visit him for the weekend. And that realization got me questioning what I wanted to be doing with the little time that I have on this planet. But it came down to choosing between podcasting and spending the last possible days on Earth with your family. The answer was pretty obvious. But he said that he is actually, in fact, getting the itch to start another show. So I asked him what he would do differently the next time in order to better manage his time and priorities. He said, "Our next project is going to be a different format with two distinct differences. First, it's going to be something that we can record ahead of time. And second, the current plan is to have a definite endpoint, probably after a year or so. So if time requires it, we could record the entire thing, and I think he means all at one time. I could take my time editing it, and then I could release it once it's all done instead of constantly having to chase a deadline." Another person responded and said, "I ran the Beige and the Bold podcast for 8 years. After 7, my co-host got tired of it and I finished out the series with guests. Honestly, we had wandered a bit away from the best version of what that project could provide." This person said, "Really, I missed having time with my friend and I miss having a co-host that I could vibe with. Getting the right alchemy of work and vision in a podcast isn't challenging or difficult or even hard. It's damn near impossible." And what he said there is basically the same way that I felt about my co-host. The conversational chemistry that I had with him was so great. I had contemplated starting a podcast for years and eventually pulled the trigger on starting one in 2019, and that was only because I found this new friend at the time who I had incredible conversations with. I knew it was worthy of sharing with others. But podcasts are just like everything else in life. We go through phases. Priorities change. Life changes. Time marches on. I will honestly really miss listening to Derek and his co-host on their show. And I'd like to thank him for teaching me how to get into podcasting myself. And also for being a guest on what turned out to be 6 episodes of this podcast. And for him and his co-host and his friend providing so much entertainment for like 4 years. And just like Knick-Knack News, that science show that I talked about earlier in this episode, Derek's show was never that popular by comparison to many of the other shows that I listened to, but it was something that I look forward to every week. In the same way that I look forward to Joe Rogan or Bill Burr or Lex Fridman or Josh and Chuck, you know. I valued that show pretty much about the same as I did those other ones. And it was even kind of cooler because unlike those more popular people, I kind of actually knew these guys in real life, at least one of them, and I interacted with the other once, I guess. And honestly, it will kind of feel strange going to work in the next few months and not seeing any of their new episodes on my feed. When I listened to their show, it felt like hanging out and listening to a fun conversation between 2 fun friends. That's kind of how the best podcasts are. The good ones make you almost feel like you're hanging out with a friend, even if you've actually never met them. Like, for example, I feel like I know so much about the comedian Bill Burr because I listened to him talk about his day for an hour every week, twice a week. And I've probably done that for the last 5 years. And yet if I saw him on the street, he would have no idea who I even was. It's kind of weird, right? But if Bill Burr suddenly stopped podcasting, I would almost feel like I lost a friend, you know? Podcasting is strange like that because when you're talking into the void, you have no idea who is listening or who values your content and how much it means to them or doesn't mean to them. And most times, if it does mean a lot to people, they don't actually speak up. People really usually only rush to the internet to complain about something they're angry about. Very few people actually go there to thank or show appreciation for the content creators. I need to get better at writing to my favorite podcast hosts or whatever and saying something as simple or pointless as, "Hey, thanks, I really appreciate what you're doing." Sometimes it feels awkward or weird or stupid to do something like that, but you have to realize that the people on the other side are human. So, to all of you artists, creators, and podcasters who are out there thanklessly doing what you do for God knows what reason, I want to take this opportunity to reach out and say that I appreciate what you're doing. This has been the Great Big Intergalactic. See you on the next one. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com. TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic. Or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.